America as a great nation has seen more than her fair share of war over her long history. But undeniably, one of the most historical and integral wars in her history was the American Civil War. Known as the bloodiest war in United States history, the American Civil War was a scene filled with bloodshed, death, and a plethora of all other shocking horrors. Welcome to Crazy Histories, where we bring you the craziest, weirdest facts from human history. Join us today as we look at shocking things that were normal during the American Civil War. Prisoners were left naked. Camp Sumter, more commonly known as Andersonville, was a Confederate-run prisoner of war camp built to house Union soldiers during the Civil War. Oh, and it was also a hellhole. Thanks to rampant disease, overcrowding, and exposure to the elements, 13,000 men died within its brief 14 months of existence. At its worst, well over 130 Union prisoners died every day. Now we go to Macon County, Georgia, in the mid-1860s. You have to remember, the Confederacy could barely take care of their own soldiers, so it was no surprise that they had little provisions or care for their Union prisoners. Many of these Union soldiers wore rags or nothing at all. Sometimes due to the elements, they were robbed by their own road comrades for their clothes. Union Private Prescott Tracy, an Andersonville prisoner, gave harrowing first-hand testimony on August 16, 1864, of his time captured. The clothing of the men was miserable in the extreme. Very few had shoes of any kind. Not 2,000 had coats and pants, and those were latecomers. More than one-half were indecently exposed, and many were naked. These prisoners had no protection from the elements either. As Private Tracy continued, "Our only shelter from the sun and rain and night dews was what we could make by stretching over us our coats of scraps of blankets, which a few had. But generally there was no attempt by day or night to protect ourselves." Prisoners escaped by playing dead. Escaping from Andersonville was a routine pastime among the prisoners, but the men who tried were rarely successful. And if they did escape, the elements usually killed them. But that didn't stop a large segment of inmates from forming small groups that would constantly dig tunnels under the fort's walls to freedom. POWs dug at night and carried away the fresh dirt in their pockets, letting it fall as they walked the camp during the day, a la Andy Dufresne in Shawshank, while sick inmates lay over the holes during the daytime so Confederate guards wouldn't discover their schemes. The exits of these tunnels would end up towards the nearby forests, approximately 50 feet from the walls. Unfortunately for the POWs, even if they escaped Andersonville through a tunnel, they were too weak to make a legitimate run for it. When these prisoners were caught, they were either denied rations, chain-ganged, or shot. Some prisoners escaped by playing dead. Because so many men died every day, it was easy for an inmate to lay down with a bunch of corpses and then get carried out to a row of bodies outside the walls and await their mass burial. As soon as night fell, the men would get up and run, drinking water in punishments for prisoners of war. The only source of water the Andersonville prisoners had was a man-made channel that trickled through the middle of the camp. The water came from a nearby creek, which also served as the camp's latrine, and it was filled at all times with urine and fecal matter from the inmates. The Confederate guards didn't help, as it was reported that they also contaminated the water on purpose. Private Tracy's testimony reported that the guards frequently dumped a large amount of the vilest material into the stream. The stream was the only source of drinking and cooking water for the POW at the camp. Unfortunately, it also kept them sick for the entirety of their time there. Besides polluting the prisoners' only source of clean water, Confederate guards inflicted cruel and unusual punishment on their Union prisoners. For example, when the inmates got caught stealing, and there was a lot of stealing amongst POWs, they'd be either put in the stocks, or they were forced to wear a ball and chain. And if a sick prisoner was missing at the daily roll call, inmates might be deprived of the ration. One Union prisoner, John L. Ransom, a quartermaster of Company A, 9th Michigan Volunteer Cavalry, kept a diary during his time at Andersonville. In one horrific scene, he wrote about witnessing Confederate guards shoot a sick POW. Ransom recalls watching the feverish half-dressed POW deliberately walking to the deadline, where the guard fired, sending a ball through his brain. and the poor fellow fell in the ditch. Ransom wrote, "Perhaps he is better off and a much easier death than to die of disease, as he undoubtedly would in a few days longer." Basically a self-imposed death by firing squad, and this method wasn't uncommon. Their diets were weird. The Army intended for their rations to only last 3 days on an active campaign. Unfortunately, fresh meat often spoiled or became infested with flies shortly after the soldiers received it. So the Army pickled meat to make it last longer. Thus, salt beef and salt pork were born. The two types of meat were often standard rations at the time. Salt beef, otherwise known as salt horse, was described by veteran John D. Billings as thoroughly penetrated with saltpeter, often yellow-green, with rust from having laying out in the brine. And when boiled, was 4 times out of 5, if not 9 times out of 10. A stench of the nostrils, which no delicate palate cared to encounter at shorter range. Sounds delicious. Salt pork, or salt belly, didn't receive much praise either, because it was usually black, rusty, and decidedly unpopular. Soldiers had to soak the pickled meats in water just to make them palatable. After that, they could be pretty versatile. Cooks might boil the meat or stew with beans. Sometimes soldiers consumed the meat uncooked as a sort of sandwich. Of course, the sandwich bread wasn't your typical 12-gram whole wheat loaf. It was hardtack. Ultimately, Billings found the salt pork preferable to the musty and rancid salt horse. Even at that, he thought the meat was indigestible and unpalatable. Most of the soldiers were underage boys. Of the 2.7 million soldiers who fought in the Civil War in over 237 named battles, along with a bunch of smaller, albeit bloody face-offs and confrontations, they all weren't brawny, bearded adult men with wives and slaves back home. Approximately 420,000 were northern boys under the age of 17, and the South had an estimated 100,000 soldiers under the age of 15. These boys weren't landowners, and they definitely didn't own slaves. As a matter of fact, it's reported that the teens on both sides of the war had neutral feelings toward slavery. The reason why these kids joined the war was simply that they wanted to escape their dull farm lives at home. Thanks to Abraham Lincoln's call for a short 90-day tour of duty, a Union soldier could enlist, put in his combat time for a few months, and then return home for accolades and a hero's welcome. What the Northern soldiers couldn't have predicted was that the Civil War was going to drag out for years. After the Union was driven out of Richmond in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, the Confederate Army began to march on to Washington. The South was starting to look like they had a chance to win this thing, thanks to their Peninsula win. That's when Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 more Union soldiers with 3-year commitments. Only a fraction of those 300,000 Union soldiers would last their 3 years of brutal combat. How desperate were the underage boys to join the Civil War and begin living life? Well, they'd bend a lot of rules to get in. For example, they relied on semantics, because the rules of combat stated that a soldier must be over 18 to join the military. An underage kid would write the number 18 on the sole of his shoe, or stuff a piece of paper with the number 18 scrawled on it and hide it in his boot. Then when the recruiter would ask if the boy was over 18, the future war hero would technically be telling the truth by answering, "Yes, I'm over 18. If that didn't work, the kids would just lie about their age because social security numbers, driver's licenses, and Spokio didn't exist. If all else failed, the teens just asked their fathers to vouch for them. That said, not all teens carried arms. A lot of the kids signed up for non-combat roles like joining the band as a drummer, flautist, or bugler. These non-combat roles also included being the kid to carry canteens, bandages, and stretchers. Some of the more skilled soldiers even assisted surgeons and nurses with the wounded and acted as a carrier pigeon by relaying orders on the battlefield. With all that has been said, what do you think about the American Civil War? Which of these practices was the most shocking to you? Which other historical eras would you like us to talk about? Tell me your answers down in the comment section. Hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also hit the bell as well so you don't miss any video, cause We have a lot more interesting things to come. See you soon.